Jeffrey Hyman grew up in a Jewish family in Forest Hills, Queens, with supportive parents and a brother who would share music obsessions. He first played drums in a local glam-leaning group, then joined Neighbors to form a new band that took the surname Ramone. As frontman, Joey balanced a gentle offstage manner with a tall, striking presence on stage, shaping a vocal style that carried melody through speed and volume. The group developed a tight circle around the Queens neighborhood and lower Manhattan venues, building a working alliance that withstood constant friction over taste, politics, and credit. The Ramones established a blueprint for American punk: fast songs, concise structures, and a uniform aesthetic of leather jackets and minimal stage patter. Joey became the public face, speaking for the band in interviews and anchoring tours that reached the United Kingdom and beyond. He collaborated with managers, labels, and producers who favored clarity and punch, leaving a catalog that traveled from independent rooms to larger theaters. In later years, he supported younger groups, hosted radio programs, and appeared at benefits, tying his reputation to community-minded efforts in New York. Illness emerged in the late 1990s when Joey received a diagnosis of lymphoma. Treatment continued while he remained active in recordings and appearances, but his health declined. He died in April 2001 in New York City with family nearby. A posthumous solo album expanded his legacy, shaped from sessions completed during treatment and guided by close collaborators after his death. Joey was interred at New Montefiore Cemetery in West Babylon, New York. The grave draws steady visitors who leave pics, notes, and small offerings. The stone bears his birth name and stage name, reflecting both family identity and public role. The site is reachable from the city by car, making it a regular stop for fans who plan cemetery visits around Long Island routes. The resting place's modest setting contrasts with an influence that defined an era. The grave functions as a stable point for a band that prized movement, speed, and constant touring, giving a fixed address to a sound that once sprinted through clubs and across continents. Douglas Colvin spent childhood years in Europe as part of a military family before settling in New York, where friendships in Forest Hills connected him to John Cummings and Jeffrey Hyman. He adopted the stage name Dee Dee and helped form the Ramones, taking on bass duties and a central songwriting role. Relationships inside the band were close and volatile, with Dee Dee's partnership with Joey shaping lyrics and hooks while his bond with Johnny set tempo and attack. Outside the group, he pursued solo projects, married, and moved through creative circles that included visual art and memoir writing. As principal lyricist for many early tracks, Dee Dee defined subject matter and tone, concise language, street detail, and dark humor. He counted off songs with a signature shout that became part of the band's identity. Beyond the Ramones, he recorded rap-flavored material under a different alias, issued punk solo records, and published a memoir that documented scene realities with unvarnished detail. The writing informed later histories, giving researchers a primary voice on rehearsal habits, touring, and the economics of working clubs. Years of substance struggles led to repeated treatment efforts and periods of sobriety, followed by relapses. Dee Dee died in June 2002 in Los Angeles in a drug-related incident. The death came 1 year after Joey's passing and preceded Johnny's, marking a period of loss for the original lineup and for a generation of fans who saw the band's history turn into memorial practice. Dee Dee is buried at Hollywood Forever in Los Angeles. The grave features a headstone with his names and dates and often displays offerings, guitar picks, and handwritten notes. The cemetery's setting within the city's cultural landscape makes the site active, with visitors linking the stop to the nearby cenotaph for Johnny and to other music figures on the grounds. The inscription emphasizes authorship, aligning with his reputation as the band's narrative engine. The resting place anchors the memory of a songwriter whose voice shaped punk's vocabulary. A fixed grave within a public cemetery allows fans and historians to mark authorship in physical space, pairing documented credits with a location that endures. John Ritchie grew up in London within a difficult home environment, moving through schools and social services before finding a chosen family in the city's young music circles. He became close to John Lydon, joined his friend's circle of creatives, and adopted the name Sid Vicious. Relationships with fellow musicians and managers were turbulent, but they reinforced a public image shaped by clothes, attitude, and a confrontational stance. His bond with Nancy Spungen became central to his life, drawing attention that often eclipsed the band itself. Vicious entered the Sex Pistols during a period of intense public scrutiny, replacing the original bassist as the group's notoriety peaked. Although limited as a musician, he embodied the visual code of the band: slim silhouette, spiked hair, leather, and a fixed scowl. His presence sustained the group's impact as a cultural event that collided with British institutions, television standards, and tabloid expectations. After the band fractured, he attempted a solo path in New York with support from friends and scene figures, performing short sets that leaned on covers and spectacle more than musical range. Legal trouble followed the death of Spunkin in October 1978 at the Chelsea Hotel in Manhattan. Vicious faced a homicide charge while out on bail and cycled through brief incarceration and detox efforts. He died in February 1979 in New York in a heroin-related incident shortly after a release gathering. The passing ended formal proceedings and cemented his place as a flashpoint in debates over celebrity, accountability, and the risks embedded in a marketed nihilism. Reports hold that Vicious's ashes were scattered rather than placed in a cemetery plot, with stories linking remains to sites connected to Spunkin and to informal locations in New York and London. Fans have long maintained unofficial memorial spots, including the Chelsea Hotel and various venues and murals, creating a distributed network of remembrance instead of a single grave. Objects left at these sites, safety pins, notes, and small photos, mark an improvised practice of mourning. The absence of a fixed burial aligns with a legacy carried more by imagery than by recordings. A diffuse memorial map mirrors a career composed of brief performances, court appearances, and media shocks, leaving historians to track the phenomenon through photographs, police records, and fan rituals rather than a headstone. Jan Paul Bem grew up in Los Angeles with a close friendship to Georg Ruthenberg, later known as Pat Smear. They met in local schools and shared an immersion in Bowie, glitter, and early punk imports, building a small circle that became the Germs. Bem adopted the name Darby Crash and cultivated a presence that combined charisma with strict ideas about loyalty and group identity. Relationships inside the band were intense and unstable, testing bonds with Smear, Lorna Doom, and Don Bullies as they learned on stages across Southern California. The Germs condensed a raw, tumbling sound that influenced the earliest Los Angeles hardcore generation. Crash wrote lyrics that mixed private codes with apocalyptic imagery, while Smear's guitar struck a jagged counterpoint against chaotic rhythm. The band left a brief but decisive mark with a single studio album recorded with Joan Jett, shaping how local clubs programmed faster sets and how later groups organized shows and flyers. Contemporary zines, radio segments, and fan tapes documented a scene in motion, with Crash at the center as a figure who fused spectacle with fatalism. In December 1980, Crash died in Los Angeles by self-inflicted harm after a period of heavy substance use and personal strain. Friends recalled a controlled farewell gathering, followed by his death at a home in the Fairfax district. The loss arrived as the scene accelerated toward faster tempos and more confrontational audiences, turning the Germs from a living act into a reference point and cautionary tale for the next wave. Crash is buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California. The gravesite is straightforward, a marker within a well-kept Catholic cemetery that also holds other figures from the region's cultural history. Fans visit with small offerings, pins, and notes, often pairing the stop with nearby resting places of peers from overlapping circles. The site provides a fixed coordinate for a band otherwise known through scarce studio work and scattered live recordings. The burial's clarity counters the myths that grew after his death. A documented plot, a name on stone, and a city map reference ground the profile of a singer often retold through rumor, ensuring that memorial practice aligns with verifiable records. Marianne Elliott Said grew up in London within a mixed heritage family, moving between coastal and city settings, before finding a creative home in the capital's emerging punk scene. She adopted the name Polly Styrene after a formative encounter with a concert that clarified her sense of purpose, and soon formed X-Ray Specs with allies from local clubs and rehearsal rooms. Relationships with bandmates, including Laura Logic and later saxophonists, shaped an unusual lineup that centered voice and horn, while managers and independent labels navigated a fast rise through press attention and televised appearances. Polly led with a distinctive vocal timbre and a clear focus on consumer culture, identity, and media saturation. Songs applied plain language to sharp ideas, matching driving rhythms with saxophone lines that cut through guitars. The group's image, braces, day-glow colors, and off-the-rack clothes contradicted glamour while asserting agency and humor. She stepped back from full-time performance in the late 1970s, explored spiritual paths, and later returned to recording and visual art. Collaborations across decades showed a consistent commitment to direct speech and to support for younger artists who saw her as a model of independence. Health challenges emerged in later life, including a cancer diagnosis that became public during a return to the press cycle. Polly died in April 2011 in England, with family involved in care and statements. The death prompted worldwide tributes that emphasized her writing, her voice, and the way she expanded what a punk front person could look and sound like. Reshoots and documentaries reinforced her place in the canon, connecting early recordings to new audiences. She was buried in the United Kingdom with services that reflected family traditions and a desire for privacy. Although the grave lies outside the United States, American fans have long treated memorial sites and tribute events as pilgrimages, from record shops and screening venues to murals and festival stages. These gatherings often feature covers of X-Ray Spex songs, readings from interviews, and displays of zines and posters that trace her international impact. The resting place, grounded in British soil, contrasts with a transatlantic legacy that continues to draw visitors and scholars. Memorial practice bridges continents, locating her influence in community spaces as much as in the cemetery, and affirming a message of inclusion and self-definition that remains central to her story. Thomas Miller grew up between New Jersey and Delaware before settling in New York, where friendships with Richard Hell and Richard Lloyd formed the basis of a band that took the name Television. He adopted the stage name Tom Verlaine, drawing on a poet's surname to signal an art-minded approach. Relationships within the CBGB circle included Patti Smith, whose partnership with Verlaine spanned music, poetry, and shared stages. The band's internal chemistry was exacting and sometimes tense, yet it produced a distinct interplay between Verlaine and Lloyd that rewarded careful rehearsal and restraint. Television's contribution hinged on clarity and space. Verlaine's guitar lines favored clean tone, interlocking parts, and extended figures that avoided blues cliché while sustaining momentum. The album Marquee Moon became a touchstone for art punk and post-punk, influencing guitarists who prized precision over distortion. Verlaine released solo records that deepened his approach to melody and structure, composed film-adjacent pieces, and collaborated selectively, maintaining an image of quiet dedication rather than celebrity. Critics and peers cited his work as a model for economy, phrasing, and attention to arrangement. In later years, Verlaine kept a low public profile, performing occasional shows, contributing to friends' projects, and living modestly in New York. He died in January 2023 in Manhattan after a brief illness reported by family and close friends. The news prompted tributes that traced a direct line from downtown stages in the 1970s to independent rock generations across the United States and Europe. His burial was private, consistent with a lifetime of guarded personal boundaries. No public gravesite has been promoted by the family, and memorial practice has centered on concert dedications, record store displays, and written appreciations. Fans often visit CBGB-related addresses and former venues, using street corners and facades as coordinates for remembrance rather than a marked plot. The absence of a public grave aligns with Verlaine's preference for understatement. The legacy resides in the recorded precision of his parts and in venues he made significant, allowing commemoration to occur in rooms and on records rather than at a monument. Eric Purkhiser met Christy Wallace in Ohio before the pair moved to Sacramento and then to Akron and New York, forming a partnership that defined the Cramps. He adopted the name Lux Interior, and she became Poison Ivy, a creative and personal alliance that anchored the band's sound, image, and decisions. Friends, photographers, and small label allies helped shape an aesthetic pulled from rockabilly, surf instrumentals, exploitation film culture, and thrift store couture. The couple presented a unified front with Ivy's guitar language and band leading complementing Lux's voice and stagecraft. The Cramps fused punk energy with mid-century American rock forms, creating a psychobilly template that influenced clubs, flyers, and fashion worldwide. Lux sang with reverb-soaked phrasing, yelps, and croons, performing in heels or barefoot while roaming the edge of stages and dance floors. The band's shows at venues and institutions, including a famed performance at a state hospital, became part of an underground canon. Records released on independent labels and through international partners carried the style into Europe, Japan, and South America, seeding scenes that cited the Cramps as primary inspiration. In early 2009, Lux experienced an aortic condition that led to sudden decline. He died in February 2009 in Glendale, California, with Poison Ivy and close associates managing communications and arrangements. Tributes emphasize the couple's lifelong collaboration and the way their archives documented a sustained vision over decades, from posters and handbills to carefully sequenced albums. Lux was cremated, and the family kept details of any disposition private. There is no public grave. Memorial practice has centered on club nights, tribute concerts, and fan pilgrimages to locations tied to the band's history. from record stores in the East Village to venues across Los Angeles. Murals, zine reprints, and exhibitions of flyers serve as touchstones, while Ivy's stewardship of the legacy maintains continuity without a cemetery marker. The absence of a fixed site reinforces the itinerant nature of the band's culture, rooted in live rooms and ephemera. Memory persists in recordings, posters, and the continuing influence on performers who blend vintage American styles with punk urgency, a legacy sustained through scenes rather than stone. Alan Bermowitz grew up in Brooklyn within a working-class family and studied visual art before entering the downtown scene that would form Suicide. He adopted the name Alan Vega and partnered with Martin Rev, building a duo that collapsed rock instrumentation into voice, synths, and drum machine. Relationships with gallery communities and independent promoters placed the group at the intersection of performance art and minimal music. Vega maintained ties with artists and filmmakers while navigating a sparse, collaborative circle that resisted conventional band hierarchies. Suicide's contribution rested on repetition, volume, and confrontation. Vega sang in a stark croon, shifting to shouts and spoken threats, while Rev supplied motoric patterns and abrasive textures. Early shows drew hostility, bottles, and booze that later hardened into respect as punk and industrial audiences absorbed the lesson of reduction. Records across the late 1970s and early 1980s offered a blueprint for electronic punk, with Vega's solo work extending the aesthetic into rockabilly inflections, torch elements, and stark ballads. Interviews and visual art affirmed a commitment to simplicity, tension, and the drama of risk taken in small rooms. Vega continued to record and exhibit across decades, sustaining a modest livelihood through music, neon sculptures, and limited editions. He died in July 2016 in New York, with a family statement emphasizing his peaceful passing at home. Musicians across scenes, from indie to techno, marked the loss by tracing lines from Suicide's club sets to contemporary electronic performance. His burial was private, consistent with a long-standing preference for controlled exposure. No public gravesite has been promoted, and memorial practice has moved to concert tributes, gallery shows of his visual work, and screenings of archival performances. Fans often visit former venues and neighborhood addresses to situate his story within the city's geography. The choice of privacy aligns with an artist who turned minimal means into maximum effect. Remembrance now occurs through speakers and light, a fitting continuation for a figure who treated stage, room, and audience as the essential instruments. Mark Edward Smith grew up in Salford and Prestwich, forming the Fall with friends from local jobs and the Manchester scene. Relationships within the band were intense and revolving, with Smith as the constant center while lineups shifted around him. Partnerships crossed into personal life through marriages to bandmates and collaborators, creating a web of loyalties and departures that fed the group's narrative. Managers, independent labels, and radio champions supported a schedule that kept the band touring and recording across Britain, Europe, and the United States. The Fall's contribution lay in persistence and method. Smith delivered a talk-singing style that bent around rhythm, with lyrics that mixed working-class observations, occult references, and cranky humor. The group favored repetition, motoric pulses, and jagged guitar figures, issuing a long chain of albums and singles that documented ongoing change rather than reinvention. American underground bands drew heavily from this approach, adopting the emphasis on groove, texture, and oblique commentary. Sessions for radio and television preserved a moving portrait of Smith as a conductor of momentum rather than a conventional frontman. In later years, Smith worked through health problems while continuing to tour, sometimes performing from a chair and adapting set structures to capacity. He died in January 2018 in Manchester after a period of illness reported by family and management. Tributes from musicians and critics underscored how the catalog mapped several decades of British independent music and its influence on US post-punk and indie rock. Smith received a funeral service in Manchester, followed by burial in the United Kingdom with family present. Fans have visited the graveside and nearby pubs associated with the band, leaving flowers, notes, and copies of 7-inch sleeves. Local events and exhibitions have provided further markers, situating his memory within the city that shaped the group's character. The resting place's modest profile matches a career defined by steady output rather than spectacle. Memorial practice centers on records, gig posters, and the enduring idea that if it is the Fall, it is him, an identity now anchored by a plot in the region he chronicled. Stephen Baders grew up in Ohio and moved through the Cleveland scene before connecting with friends who would form the Dead Boys. He developed a close working bond with Cheetah Chrome and a circle of managers, photographers, and writers who documented the band's rise. The group's relocation to New York linked Baders to CBGB Networks, where relationships with peers and label staff shaped recording and touring plans. Later, he settled in London and built new alliances that fed the lords of the new church, blending American punk roots with a darker, theatrical approach. Baders became known for an unrestrained stage presence, climbing sound systems, confronting crowds, and testing limits that blurred performance and risk. With the Dead Boys, he recorded concise, aggressive songs that captured Midwestern grit translated to downtown stages. In The Lords, he shifted toward gothic pop structures, adopting a croon that widened his range while maintaining tension and provocation. Media profiles and fanzines followed these moves, presenting Baders as a connector across cities and eras, an artist whose persona evolved while retaining a punk core. In June 1990 in Paris, Baders was struck by a car and suffered injuries that did not at first appear fatal. He reportedly went home rather than remaining under observation, and later died from internal complications. Friends and collaborators spoke to the shock of a sudden loss that cut short plans for future recordings and tours. Closing a transatlantic chapter that had begun in Cleveland basements and peaked on New York and London stages, accounts hold that Baders' ashes were scattered in Paris, aligning with his final years based in Europe. Without a fixed grave, memorial practice has centered on clubs, plaques, and annual tributes in Cleveland, New York, and London. Fans mark anniversaries with cover sets, screenings, and walks to addresses tied to rehearsals and residences, constructing a map of remembrance that moves across the places he animated. The absence of a permanent plot mirrors a career defined by motion. Memory resides in venues, records, and city streets, a fitting record for a singer whose impact traveled widely and left traces in several capitals of punk history. Dennis Boone grew up in San Pedro, California, in a tight family that valued work and neighborhood ties. He met Mike Watt in childhood, and the friendship became the defining relationship of his musical life. They played together through school years, learned songs in garages, and formed the Minutemen with drummer George Hurley, a trio rooted in the harbor community. Boone balanced band commitments with day jobs and family responsibilities, maintaining a practical outlook that shaped touring habits and recording decisions. The Minutemen distilled punk into brief pieces that carried complex ideas with speed and economy. Boone's guitar style favored sharp chord stabs, open strings, and unexpected accents, while his voice delivered plain-spoken lines about politics, friendship, and daily labor. Albums and the landmark double set that fans cite as a manifesto presented short songs, minimal gear, and careful sequencing. Collaborations with fellow independent bands, label owners, and fanzine writers documented a cooperative network that linked West Coast scenes to the Midwest and East Coast, encouraging do-it-yourself, booking, and fair ticket prices. In December 1985, Boone died in a van crash in the Arizona desert while traveling for rest between tours. The sudden loss halted the trio's momentum and reshaped the lives of Watt and Hurley, who later formed new projects while preserving the Minutemen's catalog through reissues and oral histories. Friends and peers have described the period as a turning point, marking the end of a formative chapter in American independent music. Boone is buried at Green Hills Memorial Park in Rancho Palos Verdes, California. The grave sits within a landscape cemetery that overlooks the harbor communities he called home. Visitors leave guitar picks, notes, and copies of 7-inch sleeves, often pairing the stop with drives through San Pedro landmarks and rehearsal addresses. Memorial shows and community events keep his name active in the region's cultural calendar. The resting place connects a local identity to a national legacy. A modest plot above the port grounds a story of friendship, work, and self-reliance, providing a fixed site for a band that taught audiences how to build scenes from neighborhoods outward. Grant Hart grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, in a family that supported music and visual art, and he formed close bonds with Bob Mould and Greg Norton that became the foundation of Husker Du. He started as a drummer and backing singer, then developed into a principal songwriter whose melodies and harmonies balanced Mould's harsher edges. The trio's relationships were intense and often strained, yet they produced a sustained body of work that moved from independent labels to a major deal while maintaining an ethic of hard touring and careful craft. Hart also pursued visual art and solo recordings, building friendships with writers, photographers, and label owners across the Midwest network. Husker Du compressed speed and melody into a recognizable language that connected American hardcore to post-punk and alternative rock. Hart's songs brought tunefulness, reflective lyrics, and a pop instinct that widened the band's audience without abandoning force. His drumming favored drive and cymbal wash, while his voice carried warmth that cut through dense guitars. After the group disbanded, Hart led Nova Mob and issued solo albums that explored narrative forms, historical themes, and acoustic textures, demonstrating a continuing interest in structure and storytelling. He engaged with interviewers and archivists, offering clear accounts of studio methods and tour logistics. Health difficulties surfaced in later years, including a cancer diagnosis that he discussed in measured terms while continuing to make art and perform. Hart died in September 2017 in St. Paul, with family and longtime collaborators close by. Tributes emphasized his role in shaping a melodic path for fast guitar-driven music, noting how his songs influenced independent bands across the United States. Hart is buried at Maplewood Cemetery in Maplewood, Minnesota. The grave lies within a quiet, tree-lined setting that reflects the region's landscape, and visitors often leave notes, ticket stubs, and lyric sheets. Local radio features and anniversary events guide fans to the site, pairing the visit with stops at former venues and record stores that documented the band's rise. The cemetery setting anchors a history that might otherwise be dispersed across flyers, tapes, and memories of basement shows. The resting place underscores a Midwestern story of discipline, community, and craft. A fixed plot in Maplewood ties a national legacy to local ground, marking the contributions of a songwriter whose balance of speed and melody helped define a generation. Peter McNeish grew up around Manchester and formed close bonds within the local scene, first partnering with Howard Devoto to found Buzzcocks. He later adopted the name Pete Shelley, and after Devoto's departure, built a durable working relationship with Steve Diggle, Steve Garvey, and John Marr that carried the band through its formative run. Managers, indie label allies, and fanzine writers helped translate the group's university town origins into a wider platform, linking Manchester venues to London stages and export markets in the United States. Shelley's writing combined brisk tempos with focused melody, creating concise songs that paired nervous energy with clear hooks. Singles released through an independent distribution network demonstrated how-do-it-yourself methods could reach national charts, while tours connected punk clubs to college circuits. His lyrics addressed desire, uncertainty, and everyday life with plain language, avoiding posturing while asserting autonomy and wit. A later solo phase explored electronic textures and dance rhythms, further influencing American post-punk and indie audiences who heard continuity between punk economy and popcraft. In December 2018, Shelley died in Estonia after a heart attack, having made a home there in later years. News of his passing prompted tributes from musicians across genres who cited his catalog as a template for pairing speed with melody. Reissues and documentary features reinforced the band's role in shaping independent production and in establishing the importance of the single as an artistic and economic unit. Shelley's burial took place in the United Kingdom with family involvement, and the gravesite has drawn steady visitors from Britain and abroad. Fans leave 7-inch sleeves, handwritten notes, and set lists, often linking the visit to Manchester landmarks tied to rehearsals, early shows, and recording sessions. Memorial concerts in the region and in American cities have kept the work in circulation, with cover versions highlighting the strength of song structures that endure outside their original era. The resting place reflects a writer who made small forms carry large meaning. A modest grave anchors a transatlantic influence, demonstrating how a local scene's discipline and independent infrastructure became a durable model for punk and pop alike. Steve Albini grew up in Montana and later Illinois, developing friendships in college that led to Big Black and then Shellac, while also building a studio-centered community in Chicago. He maintained close bonds with bandmates Todd Traynor and Bob Weston, and cultivated relationships with a wide network of musicians who recorded at his facility. Albini emphasized engineering over producer credit, insisting that bands retain agency and that sessions document what a group actually sounded like in a room. This stance built trust across punk, indie, and metal scenes, making his studio a hub for collaboration and mentorship. As a guitarist and writer, Albini pursued bracing minimalism, dry tones, and exact rhythm, avoiding ornament while focusing on dynamics and attack. In the control room, he favored analog tape, live tracking, and transparent mic placement, practices that shaped records for underground groups and for widely known artists. Publicly, he argued against exploitative contracts and producer points, wrote essays and forum posts that circulated widely, and used a sharp, literal voice that valued clarity over charm. The approach influenced how independent bands budgeted, how labels structured deals, and how studios trained assistants to respect client goals. Albini died in May 2024 in Chicago after a sudden heart event. soon after Shellac had completed a new album and returned to touring. The news triggered a broad response from artists who had recorded with him or learned from his methods, emphasizing his reliability, candor, and technical rigor. Obituaries and interviews highlighted a long arc of reconsideration in his public statements, noting how he addressed past language and refined positions while continuing to work daily at the studio. He was cremated, and memorials in Chicago remained private, consistent with a life that kept attention on work rather than personal ceremony. Fans and peers have gathered informally outside Electrical Audio, leaving flowers, notes, and lists of records tracked inside its rooms. Concert dedications and listening events have supplied public outlets for remembrance, with proceeds often directed to community causes and engineering scholarships. The absence of a public grave shifts commemoration to studios, records, and the habits he taught. Control rooms, live rooms, and tape archives now serve as the practical memorial, reinforcing the idea that fidelity to a band's sound is both method and monument.